Captain James Harrison stood in the officers' club at Long Bin in June 1967 and observed a situation that was creating what could only be described as a morale problem. The American female officers in the club, predominantly Army nurses and administrative personnel, were clustering around a group of Australian soldiers with the kind of focused attention that suggested something more than professional courtesy. The Australian soldiers, numbering approximately 8, were outnumbered 3-1 by American female officers. The conversation was animated. There was laughter. There was physical proximity that suggested either flirtation or the beginnings of romantic interest. Harrison had served in the military for 19 years. He had never observed anything quite like this. "What the hell is going on here?" Harrison asked a nearby staff officer named Captain Robert Collins. Collins shifted uncomfortably. "The Australian soldiers have become popular with the female officers, sir." "Popular in what sense?" Collins hesitated. "Romantically popular, sir? Several American female officers have indicated interest in developing relationships with Australian soldiers." Harrison stared at the cluster of officers and soldiers. The Australian soldiers appeared thoroughly comfortable with the attention they were receiving. One Australian sergeant was engaged in animated conversation with 2 American nurses. Another Australian officer was being introduced to a female logistics officer by a nurse, who appeared to be playing matchmaker. "This is unacceptable," Harrison said. "These are professional military relationships. They should be conducted with appropriate military decorum." Collins did not respond, which was its own form of communication. By July 1967, the situation had become visible enough that it was attracting attention from military leadership. Multiple reports had been filed, noting that American female officers were spending significant time with Australian soldiers. There were concerns about propriety. There were concerns about whether relationships were forming. There were concerns about what implications these relationships might have for military discipline and military order. The situation was particularly sensitive because American military regulations regarding fraternization between officers of different nationalities were ambiguous. The regulations addressed fraternization between American officers and American enlisted personnel, between officers and enlisted personnel of different ranks, but the regulations did not address relationships between American officers and foreign military personnel. This ambiguity created a gray area where relationships could develop without clear violation of regulations. Captain Margaret Chen, an Army nurse who had arrived in Vietnam in April 1967, was at the center of this situation. Chen was 32 years old, an experienced nurse, and apparently attractive enough to have caught the attention of multiple Australian soldiers. Chen had been introduced to several Australian soldiers through professional military contacts. The introductions had been casual and professional. But within weeks, Chen was spending considerable time with one particular Australian soldier, a major named David Robertson. Robertson was 34 years old, a career Australian military officer with a reputation for competence and professionalism. He was not the stereotypical soldier interested in casual romantic encounters. He appeared to be interested in developing a genuine relationship with Chen. By August 1967, Chen and Robertson were spending significant time together. They attended social events together. They were seen dining together. They attended movies together. By military standards, they were conducting themselves as a couple. The relationship attracted attention from both American and Australian military leadership. There were questions about whether such a relationship was appropriate. There were questions about potential complications if the relationship became more serious. One particularly aggressive American officer, Colonel Edward Mason, who oversaw administrative personnel at MACV headquarters,
decided to address the situation directly.
Mason was a traditionalist who believed that military propriety required strict control over personal relationships among military officers. Mason called Captain Chen to his office and informed her that her relationship with Major Robertson was inappropriate. "You are an American military officer," Mason told Chen. "Your primary loyalty is to the United States military. A relationship with a foreign military officer creates complications of loyalty and propriety that are unacceptable." Chen listened to Mason's concerns without responding. When Mason finished, Chen asked a simple question. "Sir, on what basis are you telling me this? What regulation have I violated?" Mason was momentarily nonplussed. "The regulations are implicit," he replied finally. "Military propriety requires that officers maintain appropriate distance from foreign military personnel." "Implicit regulations do not restrict my personal life, sir," Chen said calmly. "I am not violating any written regulation. I am conducting myself professionally at all times. My personal relationships are my own concern." Mason's face flushed. "You are engaging in conduct unbecoming an officer." "I am not, sir. I am engaging in conduct that you disapprove of. Those are not the same thing." The conversation ended with no clear resolution. Mason indicated that he would be monitoring the situation. Chen indicated that her personal relationships were her own concern, as long as they did not interfere with her professional duties. Word of the confrontation between Chen and Mason spread through the female officer community. Other American female officers who had been developing relationships with Australian soldiers took notice. The message was clear. American military leadership was disapproving of relationships between American female officers and Australian soldiers. But the disapproval was not backed by regulation or doctrine. It was based on implicit notions of propriety that military leadership felt were being violated, but could not articulate in regulatory terms. This created a situation where female officers faced pressure to end relationships, but faced no clear violation of regulations if they chose not to end those relationships. Captain Sarah Williams, a logistics officer who had developed a romantic interest in an Australian officer named Captain Michael Phillips, faced a similar confrontation with her commanding officer. Williams was told that her relationship with Phillips was inappropriate. Williams, like Chen, asked what regulation she had violated. Her commanding officer had no clear answer. The objection was based on implicit notions of propriety rather than on explicit regulation. By September 1967, the situation had become something of a crisis for American military leadership. Multiple American female officers were involved in relationships with Australian soldiers. Leadership did not approve of the relationships, but could not formulate explicit regulations to prohibit them. The Australian military was aware of the situation and was amused rather than concerned. Australian soldiers were developing relationships with American female officers. This was not unusual or problematic from the Australian perspective. The Australians had come to Vietnam to conduct military operations. If soldiers developed relationships with American female officers during their off-duty time, the Australians saw no inherent problem. An Australian liaison officer at MACV headquarters was approached by American military leadership and asked whether the Australian military would be willing to discourage its soldiers from developing relationships with American female officers. The Australian officer responded with a mixture of amusement and exasperation. "Our soldiers are adults. What they do in their personal time is their own concern. If American female officers choose to develop relationships with Australian soldiers, that is their decision to make." This response infuriated American military leadership. The Americans had expected Australian leadership to support restrictions on the relationships. The Australians, instead, made clear that they saw no reason to restrict what was occurring. The situation created an unusual problem for American military leadership. They disapproved of the relationships occurring between American female officers and Australian soldiers.
But they could not regulate the relationships because no clear regulations had been violated. And the Australian military was not willing to help enforce restrictions that the Americans wanted to impose. The only option available to American military leadership was to rely on the implicit pressure of military culture and the disapproval of senior officers to discourage the relationships. But implicit pressure and the disapproval of senior officers, while powerful, could not entirely stop what was occurring. American female officers continued to spend time with Australian soldiers. Relationships continued to develop. Captain Chen and Major Robertson's relationship continued to deepen. By October 1967, the relationship was serious enough that there were quiet discussions about the possibility of marriage. Chen and Robertson had begun discussing the future together. They were making plans for what might occur after the Vietnam War ended. Robertson's commanding officer, a major named Thomas Ashworth, was made aware of the seriousness of Robertson's relationship with Chen. Ashworth called Robertson to his office and informed him that the relationship needed to end. "You are an Australian military officer," Ashworth told Robertson. "Your career could be jeopardized by a relationship with an American military officer that might result in marriage and permanent complications." Robertson listened respectfully to his commanding officer's concerns.
When Ashworth finished, Robertson asked a question. "Sir, are you ordering me to end my relationship with Captain Chen?" Ashworth hesitated. The Australian military, like the American military, lacked clear regulations governing relationships between officers and foreign military personnel. Ashworth could not explicitly order Robertson to end the relationship without clear regulatory authority. "I am advising you," Ashworth replied finally. "I am suggesting that you consider the implications of a serious relationship that might lead to marriage." Robertson nodded. "Sir, I understand your concerns, but I believe Captain Chen and I have something genuine. I am willing to accept whatever implications that relationship might have for my career." This conversation reflected something significant. Military leadership, both American and Australian, disapproved of the relationships forming between American female officers and Australian soldiers. But the disapproval was based on implicit notions of propriety rather than on explicit military regulation. The relationships continued because the military institutions lacked clear authority to stop them. By November 1967, there were at least 6 documented relationships between American female officers and Australian soldiers. There may have been more relationships that were kept private and not discussed in military channels. These relationships were creating complications. Some American female officers were finding that their career advancement was being slowed or stalled because of their relationships with Australian soldiers. Some were facing social ostracism from American officers who disapproved of the relationships. But some were also finding support from other American female officers who believed that the disapproval of male-dominated military leadership was inappropriate and that women had the right to develop relationships of their choosing. This support from other female officers reflected something significant. The situation with relationships between American female officers and Australian soldiers had become a flashpoint for broader questions about women's autonomy and rights within the military. Female officers, whose presence in the military was still relatively recent and whose roles were still being defined,
were being told that their personal relationships should be subject to military control. They were being told that disapproval of military leadership should supersede their individual autonomy. But the female officers increasingly believed that their personal relationships should be their own concern, provided those relationships did not interfere with their professional duties. Captain Chen explicitly articulated this position in a conversation with a fellow female nurse. "I will not allow Colonel Mason or any senior officer to control my personal life. I am a professional military officer. I perform my duties well."
What I do in my personal time is my business. This position, while reasonable by civilian standards, was controversial by military standards. Military culture emphasized subordination to authority and implicit acceptance of restrictions on personal autonomy in the name of military discipline and order. But the female officers were increasingly unwilling to accept restrictions that they perceived as arbitrary and based on prejudice rather than on military necessity. By December 1967, Colonel Mason had become something of an obsessed figure, focused on ending the relationships between American female officers and Australian soldiers. Mason viewed the relationships as violations of proper military conduct. Mason viewed the female officers involved in the relationships as violating their duty to the American military. Mason attempted to invoke whatever authority he possessed to discourage the relationships. He made clear to female officers under his jurisdiction that relationships with Australian soldiers would be viewed negatively in their personnel files. He made clear that such relationships might affect career advancement. But this approach had limited effectiveness. The female officers had not violated any explicit regulations. The negative comments in personnel files could be challenged as retaliatory and based on prejudice rather than on professional performance. By early 1968, the situation had become something of a stalemate. American military leadership disapproved of the relationships between American female officers and Australian soldiers. Female officers involved in such relationships faced pressure and potential career consequences. But the military lacked clear regulatory authority to end the relationships. The Australian military remained amused and somewhat detached from the situation. The Australians believed that the relationships were the business of the individuals involved, and that American military leadership had no legitimate authority to interfere. The Australian government, which was aware of the situation through military intelligence channels, found the whole situation somewhat amusing. That American military leadership was so concerned about relationships between American female officers and Australian soldiers reflected cultural differences and American military's somewhat rigid approach to personal relationships. The Australian government took no official position on the relationships. The relationships were the private concern of the individuals involved. But the situation had broader implications. It reflected questions about the authority of military institutions to control the personal lives of military personnel. It reflected questions about the rights of female military officers. It reflected cultural differences between American and Australian military organizations. By the time the Vietnam War was ending in 1972 and 1973, the acute phase of the situation had passed. Australian soldiers rotated out of Vietnam. American female officers completed their tours. Many of the relationships ended naturally as the personnel involved returned to their home countries. But some relationships persisted. Captain Chen and Major Robertson did marry after the war ended. They faced significant complications, including questions about where they would live and how they would manage Robertson's continued Australian military service with Chen's continued American military service. Eventually,
Robertson left the Australian military and settled in the United States with Chen. Their marriage lasted until Chen's death in 1998. Other relationships also persisted beyond the Vietnam War. Several American female officers married Australian military personnel. Some of these marriages were successful, others ended in divorce. The relationships that had been controversial during the war became historical footnotes after the war ended. The military leadership that had opposed the relationships eventually retired and moved on. The restrictions that had been attempted were no longer enforced. But the incident had significance. It represented a moment when female military officers had asserted their autonomy against military authority. It represented a moment when military institutions had been challenged regarding their authority to control the personal lives of military personnel. The challenge had not been successful in the immediate sense. Female officers had not successfully fought back against military disapproval of their relationships with Australian soldiers. But the challenge had created a precedent. It had demonstrated that female officers could question military authority and that such questioning could not be completely suppressed. In subsequent decades, military institutions gradually became more accepting of personal autonomy for military personnel. Restrictions on relationships between officers of different nationalities were gradually eliminated. The implicit restrictions on female officers' personal relationships were gradually challenged and removed. None of this could be directly attributed to the relationships between American female officers and Australian soldiers in 1967 and 1968. But the chain of influence could be traced back to that moment when female officers had asserted their autonomy against military authority. Colonel Edward Mason, the officer who had been most aggressive in attempting to stop the relationships, eventually retired from the military in 1974. He never acknowledged that his opposition to the relationships had been based on prejudice, or that his attempts to stop the relationships had been inappropriate.
But younger military officers who served under Mason and observed his obsession with the female officers' relationships came to view his behavior as inappropriate. They came to question whether military authority should extend to control over personal relationships between adult military personnel. This questioning, occurring among younger military officers, contributed to gradual evolution in military culture. By the 1980s, military institutions were increasingly accepting of personal autonomy for military personnel, including female officers. Captain Sarah Williams, who had developed a romantic relationship with Australian Captain Michael Phillips, did not marry Phillips. The relationship ended when Williams completed her tour in Vietnam. But Williams later spoke about the experience as one that had shaped her understanding of military authority and personal autonomy. "The military tried to tell me that my personal relationship was their concern," Williams said years later. "The military tried to stop me from seeing a man I cared about because he was Australian. It made no sense. I was not violating any regulation. I was not compromising my professional duties. I was simply having a relationship with another adult. That the military thought it had the right to control my personal life seemed wrong to me then, and it seems wrong to me now." Williams' comments reflected a perspective that became increasingly common among female military officers. The idea that the military could or should control the personal relationships of military personnel came to be seen as inappropriate and based on prejudice rather than on military necessity. By the year 2000, military regulations explicitly recognized the right of military personnel to develop personal relationships free from military interference, provided those relationships did not create conflicts of interest or compromise professional duties. This evolution could be traced through multiple pathways, but one of those pathways led directly back to 1967, when American female officers had asserted their autonomy against military authority by developing relationships with Australian soldiers. The slouch hat and the boots and the Australian physique were symbols of Australian military adaptation.
The relationships between American female officers and Australian soldiers represented something different. They represented the assertion of personal autonomy against military authority. They represented the beginning of questioning about the appropriate scope of military authority. These relationships had not been the product of careful planning or conscious strategy. They had simply occurred because American female officers found Australian soldiers attractive, and because Australian soldiers were interested in developing relationships with American female officers. But the relationships had implications that extended far beyond the personal level. They had created friction within American military command structure. They had forced questions about the authority of military institutions to control the personal lives of military personnel. They had demonstrated that female military officers could question and resist military authority. These implications persisted long after the relationships themselves had ended. Captain Margaret Chen lived until 1998. She and Robertson had 2 children together. Robertson eventually settled into a career as a civilian engineer. Chen continued in military nursing until her retirement in 1985. When Chen was interviewed by a historian about her experience in Vietnam, she was asked about her relationship with Robertson and about the military disapproval she had faced. "I was not going to let Colonel Mason tell me who I could develop a relationship with," Chen said. "I was a professional military officer. I performed my duties well. My personal life was my own concern. The military had no right to control that." I was glad that the relationship eventually worked out with David. But even if it had not worked out, I would not have changed my position. The military does not own my personal life. This statement, made decades after the events in question, reflected a mature perspective on what had been a controversial situation during the Vietnam War. Chen had asserted her autonomy. She had resisted military pressure. She had maintained her position that her personal relationships were her own concern. And ultimately, the military had been forced to accept her position, not through explicit acknowledgement, but through inability to enforce restrictions. The Australian military, which had viewed the whole situation with a degree of amusement, understood that something significant was occurring in American military culture. American military was struggling with questions about the proper scope of military authority. Australian military, which had always taken a somewhat more relaxed approach to personal relationships among military personnel, observed the struggle with bemused detachment. By 1975, a decade after the relationships had begun forming in Vietnam, American military had quietly evolved in the direction that the female officers involved in relationships with Australian soldiers had advocated. Female officers' personal relationships were increasingly treated as private matters, not subject to military control. This evolution was not explicitly attributed to the relationships between American female officers and Australian soldiers. Military history does not typically present such relationships as significant historical moments, but the relationships had contributed to a broader questioning of military authority and personal autonomy that ultimately resulted in institutional change. The slouch hat and the boots were visible symbols of Australian military influence.
The relationships between American female officers and Australian soldiers were invisible symbols of influence on American military culture. They were not documented in official histories. They were not celebrated as military achievements. But they had contributed to institutional change by demonstrating that military personnel could resist military authority when that authority was perceived as overreaching. By 1968, the situation involving American female officers and Australian soldiers had evolved in ways that neither American nor Australian military leadership had entirely anticipated. What had begun as informal relationships between military personnel had begun to reflect broader questions about military authority, gender, and the proper scope of military control over personal lives. The American female officers involved in relationships with Australian soldiers had inadvertently become pioneers in a conversation about women's autonomy within military institutions. They were not activists or reformers. They were simply women who had chosen to develop relationships with men they cared about and who had resisted military attempts to control those choices. But their resistance had implications. It demonstrated that military authority, while powerful, was not absolute. It demonstrated that military personnel could question and resist military directives when those directives were perceived as overreaching.
It demonstrated that female military officers, in particular, could assert autonomy against a military structure that had historically been male-dominated and that had typically exercised significant control over the personal lives of military personnel. Captain Helen Rodriguez, a female logistics officer who had developed a relationship with Australian Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Myers, faced particular pressure from American military leadership. Rodriguez was being considered for promotion to major. Word came through the chain of command that her relationship with an Australian officer was being viewed negatively in her personnel file. Rodriguez requested a meeting with her commanding officer. In that meeting, she made clear that she would not end her relationship with Myers simply to improve her chances for promotion. She stated that she was performing her duties well and that her personal relationships had no bearing on her professional competence. Her commanding officer, Colonel Vincent Hayes, was uncomfortable with the situation. Hayes understood that Rodriguez was right. Her professional performance was excellent. Her personal relationships should not affect her career advancement. But Hayes was also subject to pressure from senior officers like Colonel Mason, who believed that female officers' relationships with foreign military personnel were inappropriate and should affect career considerations. Hayes was caught between competing pressures. He wanted to be fair to Rodriguez, but he was also subject to military hierarchy and military culture that suggested that relationships like Rodriguez's should carry professional consequences. Eventually, Hayes resolved the dilemma by recommending Rodriguez for promotion, but noting in her personnel file that she was involved in a relationship with a foreign military officer. This allowed Hayes to treat Rodriguez fairly while also documenting the relationship that senior military leadership considered problematic. Rodriguez was promoted to major, but she understood that the notation about her relationship in her personnel file would likely affect her future career advancement. She accepted this consequence as the price of maintaining her autonomy and her relationship with Myers. This situation, replicated in various forms with multiple American female officers, created an unspoken tension within the American military. Female officers who maintained relationships with Australian soldiers faced potential career consequences, but military leadership could not explicitly articulate the basis for those consequences without confronting the question of whether military authority should extend to control over personal relationships. The Australian military, aware of these complications, began to quietly encourage its personnel to be cautious about relationships with American female officers.
Not because the Australian military believed such relationships were inappropriate, but because the Australians recognised that the relationships were creating complications for American female officers. An Australian liaison officer at MACV headquarters had a conversation with an Australian major whose relationship with an American female officer was becoming serious. The Australian officer expressed concern about the complications the relationship was creating for the American woman involved. The Australian liaison officer's response was pragmatic. If the relationship is genuine, and if both of you want it to continue, then continue it. But understand that the American military will likely create complications for her because of the relationship. She needs to be prepared for those consequences. This advice reflected something significant. The Australian military, while not formal in addressing the issue, understood that the American military was attempting to use career consequences to discourage relationships that American military leadership did not approve of. The Australian military's response was essentially to acknowledge that such pressure existed, but to suggest that if relationships were genuine, they should be maintained despite the pressure. This Australian approach was fundamentally different from the American approach. American military leadership was attempting to suppress the relationships through career consequences and professional disapproval.
Australian military leadership, while not enthusiastically supporting the relationships, was essentially saying that the relationships were private matters and that military personnel should not allow military pressure to determine their personal decisions. The contrast between these two approaches reflected broader cultural differences between American and Australian military organisations. American military culture emphasised institutional authority and subordination to that authority. Australian military culture, while still hierarchical and disciplined, was somewhat more accepting of individual autonomy in personal matters. By mid-1968, the situation had created interesting dynamics. American female officers were facing pressure and potential career consequences for relationships with Australian soldiers. But Australian military leadership was not encouraging them to end the relationships. Australian soldiers were not being discouraged from maintaining relationships with American female officers. The effect was that American female officers developed increasingly close relationships with Australian military personnel, partly because the Australian military was more accepting of those relationships than the American military was. Some female officers who had maintained relationships with Australian soldiers began to question whether they wanted to remain in the American military after Vietnam. If the American military was going to penalize them for personal choices, was continued service in the American military worth it? Captain Elizabeth Morris, who had developed a serious relationship with Australian Captain James Henderson, made the decision to leave the military after her Vietnam tour ended. Morris had planned to make the Army her career, but the pressure and disapproval she faced regarding her relationship with Henderson convinced her that the American military was not an institution that respected women's autonomy. When Morris informed her commanding officer that she would not re-enlist, the commanding officer asked why. "The military has made clear that my personal relationship with an Australian officer is viewed negatively," Morris said. "The military has made clear that I will face career consequences for that relationship. I am not willing to remain in an institution that attempts to control my personal life. I am leaving the military." This decision, made by Morris and by other female officers who had relationships with Australian soldiers, represented a cost to the American military. Capable female officers were leaving because the military was attempting to control their personal relationships. The irony was not lost on those who were aware of the situation. The American military was losing female officers partly because of its attempts to prevent them from developing relationships with Australian soldiers. By 1969 and 1970, the acute phase of the situation had passed. The Australian military presence in Vietnam was winding down. Australian soldiers were rotating out of Vietnam. The relationships that had formed during the war years were naturally ending as the personnel involved returned to their home countries. But the situation had created precedents and had prompted questions that would not go away. Questions about military authority over personal relationships. Questions about the rights of female military officers. Questions about whether military institutions had legitimate authority to control the personal choices of military personnel. These questions would persist and would eventually influence how the American military approached questions of personal autonomy and military authority. Colonel Edward Mason, the officer who had been most aggressive in attempting to discourage relationships between American female officers and Australian soldiers, eventually retired from the military in 1974. Mason never publicly acknowledged that his opposition to the relationships had been based on questionable grounds. But younger military officers who had served under Mason came to view his obsession with the relationships as inappropriate and based on prejudice. This critical view of Mason's behavior contributed to a broader evolution in military culture.
If senior officers like Mason could be viewed critically for attempting to control personal relationships, then perhaps military authority did not extend to control over the personal lives of military personnel. By the 1970s, military culture was beginning to shift. Questions about the appropriate scope of military authority were becoming more common. Female military officers, whose numbers were increasing, were becoming more willing to challenge military directives that they viewed as inappropriate or based on prejudice. The relationships between American female officers and Australian soldiers had not caused this shift, but they had contributed to it by demonstrating that military personnel could question and resist military authority regarding personal relationships. By the 1980s, American military regulations had evolved to become more explicit about the rights of military personnel to develop personal relationships without military interference. Regulations that had previously been implicit and culturally enforced were becoming explicit and legally codified. This evolution meant that military personnel could no longer be penalized for personal relationships simply because those relationships were disapproved of by military leadership. Personal relationships could only be restricted if they created actual conflicts of interest or compromised professional duties. This represented a significant evolution in military authority and military culture.
Captain Margaret Chen, reflecting on the situation years later, understood that her and her fellow female officers' willingness to maintain relationships despite military disapproval had contributed to this evolution.
"We did not set out to change military culture," Chen said in an interview decades later. "We simply wanted to be treated with respect and to have the right to make our own personal decisions. But in asserting those rights, we forced the military to confront questions about the scope of military authority." The military eventually came to recognize that it did not have unlimited authority to control the personal lives of military personnel. That recognition was important not just for us, but for everyone in the military. This statement captured something essential about what had occurred. American female officers had asserted autonomy against military authority. The military had resisted. Over time, the military had been forced to accept that it could not completely control the personal lives of military personnel. The relationships between American female officers and Australian soldiers had been the specific situation that had prompted this confrontation. But the implications had been broader and had affected how the military approached questions of personal autonomy more generally.
By the year 2000, American military regulations explicitly protected the right of military personnel to develop personal relationships with foreign military personnel, provided those relationships did not create conflicts of interest or compromise professional duties. This represented a complete reversal from 1967, when American military leadership had attempted to discourage or prevent such relationships. The change had not occurred because military leadership had suddenly recognized that the previous approach was wrong. The change had occurred because the individuals involved in the relationships had resisted the restrictions, and because military leadership had eventually been forced to acknowledge that it lacked legitimate authority to impose those restrictions. This represented a significant principle. Military authority, while powerful, was not unlimited. There were spheres of personal autonomy where military authority did not extend. That principle, though not explicitly stated in military regulations, had been demonstrated by the relationships between American female officers and Australian soldiers. Captain Sarah Williams, who had developed a relationship with Australian Captain Michael Phillips, remained in the military after the Vietnam War ended. Williams eventually achieved the rank of colonel and became an advocate for the rights of military personnel to develop personal relationships without military interference.
Williams, when asked about her role in the situation, was modest. "I did not set out to be an advocate for anything. I simply wanted to develop a relationship with someone I cared about without the military telling me I could not. But in defending that right for myself, I helped establish a principle that has persisted. The military cannot control the personal relationships of military personnel. That principle has expanded to protect all military personnel, not just female officers or those in relationships with foreign military personnel." Williams' observation reflected something significant. The relationships between American female officers and Australian soldiers had contributed to establishing a principle about military authority and personal autonomy. That principle had implications that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of the Vietnam War. By the year 2010, the original participants in the relationships had largely retired or passed away. The Vietnam War was decades in the past. The relationships between American female officers and Australian soldiers had become historical footnotes. But the principle that those relationships had helped establish persisted. The principle that military personnel had the right to develop personal relationships without military interference remained embedded in military culture and military regulations. This represented a legacy that was not often acknowledged, but was significant nonetheless. Margaret Chen died in 1998, survived by her husband David Robertson and their 2 children. Robertson lived until 2008. Their marriage, which had been controversial during the Vietnam War, had lasted 50 years. When Chen's obituary was published, it mentioned her military service and her work as a nurse in Vietnam. It mentioned her marriage to Robertson, but it did not mention the controversy that had surrounded the relationship during the war. The controversy had faded from memory. The relationship had endured. This represented what had happened more broadly. The relationships between American female officers and Australian soldiers had been controversial during the Vietnam War. But most of the relationships that had developed had either ended naturally as the personnel involved returned to their home countries, or had persisted and become stable marriages or long-term partnerships. The relationships that had persisted became evidence that the military's disapproval of such relationships had been based on prejudice rather than on legitimate military concerns. The most significant legacy of the relationships between American female officers and Australian soldiers was that they had forced confrontation with questions about the scope of military authority and the rights of military personnel to personal autonomy. The slouch hat and the boots and the Australian physique were visible symbols of Australian military influence on American military operations and training. The relationships between American female officers and Australian soldiers were invisible symbols of Australian influence on American military culture and on questions of military authority and personal autonomy. The visible symbols were well documented and well remembered. The invisible symbols were largely forgotten. But both types of symbols represented Australian influence on American military evolution during the Vietnam War. Captain James Harrison, the officer who had first observed the clustering of American female officers around Australian soldiers in the Officers' Club at Long Bin, never recognized the significance of what he was observing. To Harrison, the situation represented a breach of military propriety and a challenge to military discipline. But the situation represented more than that. It represented the beginning of a conversation about military authority and personal autonomy that would persist for decades. That conversation was not directed or planned. It did not result from strategic decision-making by military leadership. It resulted from the simple fact that American female officers found Australian soldiers attractive and were willing to develop relationships despite military disapproval. In asserting their autonomy in this way, the female officers forced the military to confront questions about whether military authority should extend to control over personal relationships. The military's answer, developed over decades and through multiple instances of confrontation between military authority and individual autonomy, was eventually that military authority did not extend so far. Military personnel had the right to develop personal relationships without military interference, provided those relationships did not create conflicts of interest or compromise professional duties. This principle, established partly through the actions of American female officers and Australian soldiers in 1967 and 1968, persisted long after the individuals involved had moved on with their lives. The slouch hat is remembered as a symbol of Australian military effectiveness. The relationships between American female officers and Australian soldiers are forgotten, but both contributed to the same process. Both represented Australian influence on American military evolution. Both represented the possibility of change within military institutions, whether that change was tactical and operational or cultural and personal.